The storm came without warning. Heavy winds roared across the barren expanse of the alien planet, kicking up sharp grains of sand that stung like needles. It was a landscape as unforgiving as it was beautiful, golden dunes stretching endlessly, kissed by a pale, greenish sky. He shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the kind of place where humans lingered unless they had no other choice. For him, it was a job. Dangerous, yes, but necessary. Out here, on the edge of nowhere, survival often meant pushing beyond comfort zones. Little did he know, this time it would mean something far greater. The faint sound had been nearly lost in the wind, a high-pitched whimper that could have been mistaken for the cries of the planet's native wildlife. But his instincts, honed by years of living on the edge, told him otherwise. Someone or something was out there. His heart quickened as he adjusted his mask to shield himself from the choking dust. He debated whether to investigate. This planet, after all, wasn't known for its hospitality. Predators roamed the dunes, and not all of them were animalistic. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't fear, it was curiosity. Or perhaps something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. He followed the sound, trudging through the storm with visibility reduced to mere feet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the planet itself wanted to pull him down. And then he saw her, or rather, the faint outline of her figure against the muted glow of the horizon. At first, he wasn't even sure she was alive. Her slender form lay crumpled in the sand, partially covered by a thin metallic fabric that shimmered faintly under the dim light. She didn't look human. He knew that much, immediately. Her skin was a pale lavender hue, marred with what looked like cuts or burns, and her long, flowing hair was a deep silver, tangled and matted from the storm. But it was her eyes closed and still that drew him closer. He knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. She wasn't breathing, at least not in any way he could recognize. His first thought was to check for injuries, but as his gloved hand moved closer, her eyes shot open. They were impossibly large, a shimmering gold that almost seemed to glow. For a moment, they locked onto his, and he froze. The intensity of her gaze wasn't hostile, it was desperate. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a faint, broken sound, a language he didn't understand. Still, the fear in her expression was universal. "It's okay," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping she could feel the intent behind them. He reached for the small emergency med kit strapped to his side, carefully pulling out a hydration injector. He had no idea if her physiology would tolerate it, but doing nothing felt worse. She flinched as he brought the device closer, but the desperation in her eyes outweighed her hesitation. With a trembling hand, she allowed him to press the injector to her arm. There was a soft hiss, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, she exhaled a shaky, shallow breath that seemed to ease some of the tension in her body. The storm was getting worse. He knew they couldn't stay out here much longer. Without another thought, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected, almost alarmingly so. The wind fought against him as he carried her toward the small shelter he'd set up a few miles away, but he pushed forward, driven by a sense of responsibility he didn't fully understand. By the time they reached the shelter, both of them were on the verge of collapse. Inside, the atmosphere was dim and cramped, the walls lined with scavenged equipment and supplies. He laid her down gently on the makeshift cot, adjusting the small heater to combat the chill that had settled into the room. She watched him warily, her golden eyes tracking his every move. It wasn't fear anymore, though it was something closer to curiosity. He offered her a small container of purified water, miming the act of drinking to show her it was safe. She hesitated, then took it with shaky hands. The way she drank was almost human, but there was a grace to her movements that felt otherworldly. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, knowing he wouldn't get an answer. The question wasn't really for her, it was for himself. What was she doing out there, alone and injured? Had she been attacked, or was she simply lost? And why, of all places, had she ended up here, on a planet that seemed to swallow anything fragile and spit out only the strongest? As the hours passed, she seemed to regain some of her strength. Her voice, though still weak, began to form words that sounded almost melodic, like a song carried on the wind. He couldn't understand the language, but her tone conveyed enough gratitude, perhaps, or relief. She gestured to herself, then to him, as if trying to bridge the gap between their worlds. He smiled faintly, mimicking the gesture. "I guess we'll figure this out together," he said. The connection between them was fragile, but undeniable. It wasn't just that he had saved her. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Despite the vast differences between them, there was a sense of familiarity, as though their meeting wasn't entirely by chance. But the questions lingered unanswered and heavy. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what had left her so wounded and vulnerable in the first place? As she drifted into a restless sleep, he sat nearby, his mind racing. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, but the unease in his chest hadn't. There was more to this. He could feel it. Whatever had brought her here, it wasn't over. And as he glanced back at her peaceful form, he realized that whatever was coming, he wouldn't let her face it alone. As she slept, the small shelter felt quieter than usual. The hum of the heater and the occasional groan of metal against the wind were the only sounds filling the space. He watched her, still unsure of what to make of the situation. She looked so fragile now, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The injuries on her skin had begun to scab over, though the strange shimmer of her wounds left him unsettled. Whoever or whatever she wasn't from any species he'd seen before. But there was something undeniably familiar in the way she held herself, even in unconsciousness. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world outside eerily silent. The planet was never particularly alive, but after a storm, the silence felt suffocating, as though the land itself were holding its breath. He couldn't risk staying here too long. The shelter was only a temporary station, thrown together for short stays during his scavenging runs. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that something or someone would find them. He'd seen what roamed these sands, and most of it wasn't friendly. His mind wandered as he stared out at the dunes beyond the reinforced glass of the shelter's tiny viewport. How had she ended up here? The desert wasn't just dangerous, it was remote, a wasteland that even the most desperate avoided unless absolutely necessary. If she'd been traveling, she must have come from somewhere nearby. But the nearest settlements were over 100 miles out, and none of them would have welcomed someone like her. He didn't want to think about what might have happened to her out there. He thought about the first time he'd come to this planet. Back then, it had seemed like an opportunity, a place to start fresh when everything else had fallen apart. But the promise of wealth had quickly faded, replaced by a grim reality. The planet's resources were scarce, its environment unforgiving. Those who came here usually had nowhere else to go. He'd stayed because it was easier than leaving, easier than facing the mistakes he'd made elsewhere. He didn't expect much from this place anymore, but he also didn't expect it to throw something as extraordinary. Hours passed, and she finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were unfocused, filled with confusion. But then she saw him, and the tension in her body eased. She tried to sit up, but her strength still hadn't fully returned. He rushed to her side, placing a hand gently on her shoulder to stop her. "Easy," he said softly. "You're still recovering." She looked at him, her golden eyes filled with an intensity that made him catch his breath. Slowly, she spoke again, her voice quiet and melodic, though the words were still foreign to him. She gestured toward herself, then out toward the horizon, as if trying to explain something. He shook his head slightly, frustration building. "I don't understand," he admitted, "but I want to help." She seemed to understand his intent, even if the words didn't translate. Her expression softened, and she pointed to herself again. Then, with visible effort, she managed to say one word in a halting, almost uncertain tone. "Sana." It wasn't much, but it was a start. He nodded, pointing to her. "Sana," he repeated, hoping he'd gotten it right. She gave a faint smile, the first he'd seen from her, and nodded in return. Then she gestured to him, tilting her head slightly as though asking a question. It took him a moment to realize what she was asking. "Oh," he said, pointing to himself. "Ethan." It wasn't his real name, not anymore, but it was the one he used out here. She repeated it, her voice stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar sounds, but the attempt made him smile. The small connection felt monumental in its simplicity. For the first time, they weren't just strangers. There was still a vast gulf between them, but at least now they had names to bridge it. He watched as she carefully touched one of the wounds on her arm, her expression twisting with pain. The shimmer of her skin near the wound caught the dim light of the shelter, and he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Her skin wasn't just reflecting the light, it was almost refracting it, creating tiny rainbow-like patterns. It was beautiful, but it also looked unnatural, almost as if her body was fighting to heal itself. She caught him staring and pulled her arm closer to her body, her expression guarded. He held up his hands quickly, trying to reassure her. "Sorry," he said. I've never seen anything like it." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Instead, she studied him, her gaze piercing, as though trying to figure out if she could trust him. Over the next few days, they settled into a fragile routine. He rationed the supplies he had, sharing what little food and water he could spare. She ate sparingly, her movements slow and deliberate, as though every action cost her more energy than it should. He tried to learn more about her, using gestures and expressions to communicate, but her responses were often cryptic or incomplete. Still, they managed to piece together bits of understanding. She wasn't just lost, she was running from something. And whatever it was, she was terrified of it finding her. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the dunes, she grew restless. She paced the small shelter, her movements sharper and more agitated than he'd seen before. Her golden eyes flicked toward the viewport repeatedly, scanning the horizon as though expecting something or someone to appear. He watched her quietly, his own unease growing. "What is it?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't be able to answer. But she surprised him by turning to him and pointing to the horizon, then back to herself. Her voice was low, almost a whisper as she spoke a single word. "Danger." The weight of the word settled over him like a stone. He didn't need to know the specifics to understand what she meant. Whatever she'd escaped from wasn't just a distant memory, it was still out there, and it was coming for her. He checked the perimeter of the shelter, ensuring that everything was secure, but the truth was, the place wasn't built to withstand a serious threat. If they were found, there wouldn't be much he could do to protect her or himself. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat near the cot where she lay, his weapon within arm's reach, listening to every creak and groan of the shelter. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the faint sound of something unnatural, a distant hum that didn't belong to the desert. He glanced at her, her face serene in sleep, and felt a surge of determination. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't let it take her. Not after everything she'd been through. Not after she'd placed her trust in him, however tentative it might be. As the first light of dawn crept over the dunes, the hum grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the sound of a storm, it was mechanical, rhythmic, and undeniably deliberate. He felt his heart race as he looked out at the horizon, his breath catching in his throat. Something was out there, cutting through the sands like a shadow against the rising sun. They had to move, and fast. The sound outside grew louder with each passing moment. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his weapon, trying to steady his breath. He could hear the hum growing sharper, the air vibrating with a strange energy. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural. It was as if the very desert itself had started to whisper, warning them of something far worse than a sandstorm. The small shelter suddenly felt far too fragile, a mere speck in the vast, unforgiving wasteland. Sana, still lying in her cot, stirred at the growing noise. Her eyes snapped open, wide and alert, scanning the room as though she could sense what Ethan was feeling. Without a word, she reached for the strange device on her arm, the one he'd noticed earlier, a glowing, intricate piece of technology embedded into her skin. The strange shimmer that surrounded her injuries intensified as she focused on the device, her fingers trembling as she activated it. The soft blue light flickered to life, casting an eerie glow around the room. Ethan didn't know what she was doing, but he had learned by now that it was best not to question her actions. If anything, he needed to trust her more than ever. The hum outside was no longer a distant sound. It was close, too close. It wasn't just mechanical now. It was something else, something that resonated deep in the pit of his stomach. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to find safety. But there was nowhere to go. He glanced back at Sana. Her eyes, once filled with confusion and fear, now burned with a quiet resolve. She stood up, her movements fluid but deliberate. Every step she took was calculated, as though she had known for some time what was coming. The fear that had lingered between them, the invisible barrier that kept them from truly connecting, was gone. In its place was something deeper, a shared understanding. Whatever this was, they would face it together. Sana's glowing arm reached out toward him, and for the first time since they met, she spoke again, this time in a voice laced with both urgency and something else, something almost desperate. "We must move," she said, the words heavy with meaning. Ethan barely had time to react before she was already at the shelter's entrance, scanning the horizon with a determined gaze. The sound outside reached its peak, an unnatural roar that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Ethan felt a chill wash over him, even in the warmth of the shelter. Whatever it was no longer just approaching, it was here. His pulse quickened, and he followed her instinctively, grabbing what little gear he could find. But even as they rushed toward the exit, the world outside seemed to freeze for a moment, as if waiting for something to happen. Then, the ground shook beneath them. It wasn't a small tremor, like the ones they'd felt from distant quakes before. This was different. This was the kind of force that made the shelter groan, as though it were about to collapse under the pressure. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon as he reached Sana's side, the two of them stepping out into the open, their eyes wide with shock. Before them, rising from the dunes like a monstrous shadow, was a ship, its sleek, metallic surface gleaming against the pale light of the moons. But this wasn't any kind of shit he'd ever seen before. It was massive, a towering structure, almost alive with a strange alien energy that flickered around its edges. The hum had grown into a deep, reverberating sound, echoing from the ship's core like a heartbeat. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The ship's engines pulsed with an eerie glow, sending ripples through the air that made the very atmosphere crackle with energy. There were no windows, no visible doors, but the ship didn't need them. It was as if it was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. Sana's gaze never wavered from the ship. She had seen this before. She had known it was coming. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute acceptance. Her fingers hovered over the device on her arm again, the light intensifying as she made adjustments, though the details were still a mystery to Ethan. What was she doing, and why did the ship feel so familiar to her? Ethan's mind raced as the ship's engines powered up, sending a low rumble through the ground. The ship was alive now, and it was moving toward them, slowly but surely, its enormous silhouette casting an ominous shadow across the sand. He turned to Sana, his breath catching in his throat. "What is that thing?" Sana's voice was calm, almost too calm. "It's my people. They've come for me." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Your people? But they're not like me," she cut in sharply, her voice tight with emotion. "I was different. I escaped." Before he could ask anything further, the ground shook again. The ship was closing in, and there was nowhere to run. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what was happening bearing down on him. He knew they couldn't stay here. But where could they go? The ship was too fast, too powerful. Sana turned to him, her golden eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, nor was it pity. It was something else entirely, something like regret, but mixed with a fierce determination. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her fingers cold against his skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this to happen." Ethan shook his head, barely able to process what she was saying. "Don't say that. We'll figure it out. But his words were cut off as the ground erupted beneath their feet. From the distance, the ship released a wave of energy that surged across the desert like a tidal wave of raw power. The air crackled as it hit the ground, sending a shockwave that knocked both of them off their feet. Ethan felt his body slam into the sand, his vision blurring as he tried to push himself up. But before he could do anything, the ship's engines roared to life once again, and in a blink, it was hovering just above them. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, like a mountain coming down from the sky. Sana's eyes flicked toward him, a silent plea for him to understand. "They're not who they seem," she said in a low voice, almost to herself. "And I'm not who they think I am." Before Ethan could ask anything else, the air around them shifted again. The wind began to whip up, swirling around them in a violent cyclone. The ground beneath their feet trembled once more. But this time, it wasn't just the force of the ship or its mysterious occupants. There was something else, a power, ancient and untamed, pulsing from the heart of the desert itself. A deep, resonant hum thrummed in the air, vibrating in his bones. It was almost as if the entire planet had come alive. The figure turned, sensing it too. "No," he hissed, his voice laced with rage. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Ethan's eyes widened as the sand beneath their feet began to shift, rising into the air in massive columns. It wasn't a natural storm. This was something else. Something that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for this exact moment. A massive pulse of energy burst from the heart of the desert, far in the distance, and then another one, and another. The ground shook violently beneath them as an enormous shadowy shape began to form in the distance. It was like a wave of darkness, growing larger with every passing second. The figure's face twisted in horror. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to." Before he could finish, the shadow surged forward, swallowing the horizon in its wake. Ethan grabbed Sana's arm, pulling her toward him as the ground began to buckle. The very air seemed to crack and split open. The last thing he saw before everything turned to chaos was the figure's face, a twisted mask of fear, as the dark wave surged forward, unstoppable. And then everything went black. The world around them exploded in chaos, the very earth itself shaking as if it were caught in the grip of a primal force. The swirling darkness loomed ever closer, its massive, inky form consuming the horizon, blotting out the sky. Ethan gripped Sana tightly, his heart racing, unsure of what was happening. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't comprehend, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. Every instinct screamed for him to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The figure, who had once seemed so confident, now stood motionless, staring into the abyss. His armor glinted in the strange light as he muttered something under his breath, his voice tinged with desperation. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Ethan felt a deep, unsettling weight in his chest, as though the very nature of the universe was shifting around him. He looked down at Sana, her face etched with fear, but also determination. She'd been running from something, hiding from something, but now he could see it clearly. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something much larger. A conflict that went beyond him, beyond her. The dark shape surged forward, the ground beneath their feet trembling more violently with each passing second. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, as though something massive was building up a storm that had been gathering for centuries. It wasn't just a battle. It was a reckoning. As the shadow neared, a loud crack split the air, followed by a deafening roar. The figure's eyes widened, filled with a mixture of disbelief and terror. "It's waking." Sana's hand tightened around Ethan's, pulling him closer. "We don't have much time. They're not going to stop. You have to understand this has always been my destiny." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the ground beneath them buckled and cracked open. From the depths of the earth, a blinding light shot up, splitting the sand and rock like paper. The light was overwhelming, pure and intense, filling everything around them. For a split second, the world around them seemed to vanish, leaving only the brightness. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Ethan stood, dazed, his heart pounding in his ears. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes searching the area. The shadow had halted. Everything was still. The figure, who had once been so powerful, now knelt on the ground, his head bowed. The armor he wore, which had once gleamed with an intimidating shine, now looked dull, almost as if it were losing its strength. The power he had radiated moments ago seemed to be fading, leaving only a hollow shell. Sana, still gripping Ethan's hand, stepped forward. Her eyes were calm, but there was an edge to her presence now, something unmistakable. "It's over," she said, her voice steady but filled with authority. "You failed." The figure's head jerked up at the sound of her voice, his eyes burning with fury. You're not supposed to be the one to end this." Sana shook her head, her expression hardening. "You never understood who I really am. I wasn't running from you. I was hiding from something much bigger. And now I've stopped running. Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. What was she saying? What had she just done? The person standing in front of him wasn't the same Sana he had met days ago. She was different, stronger, more resolute. He had seen hints of it before, but now it was clear. Sana had always known what needed to be done. She had always known who she was. The dark figure, still kneeling before them, let out a low, guttural laugh. It was a sound of defeat, as though the fight had been taken from him. You think this is the end? You've only seen a fraction of the truth. Sana's eyes narrowed. No, you've seen the truth. And now, the power that you thought you controlled will belong to me. In that moment, something in the air shifted. The dark figure's armor cracked and splintered, pieces falling away, revealing a hollow, empty form beneath. The darkness that had been swirling around them, the force that had seemed unstoppable, began to recede, retreating back into the desert like a fading storm. Ethan's mind spun with the revelation. Sana hadn't just been hiding from them. She had been protecting something that had been building within her all along. And now it was unleashed. The power that had been dormant for so long was hers to command. But even as the figure crumbled before them, the tension didn't fully lift. There was a stillness that felt unnatural, as though they were on the edge of something far greater. Sana turned to him, her gaze softening for the first time in what felt like forever. It's not over, she whispered. There's more to this story than we can see right now. More layers to uncover. Ethan nodded, his heart still racing. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. The world had changed in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. And no matter what came next, the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more revelations, and more truths waiting to be uncovered. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. The shadow was gone, the figure broken, and the force that had once threatened to destroy everything had faded. Still, as they stood there, the desert stretching out before them, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. Sana gave him one last look, a glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. We've won this battle, she said, her voice steady. But the war isn't over yet. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. As the desert stretched out before them, an eerie calm hung in the air. The once thundering force that had nearly torn apart their world was gone, but the silence felt like a warning, a promise that something bigger, something darker, loomed just beyond the horizon. Ethan stood there, his heart still racing, unsure of what would come next, yet feeling an undeniable sense of finality in the air. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't alone anymore. Sana, standing beside him, was different. The person who had once seemed fragile, unsure, was now a force of nature. The power that had once been hidden deep within her was no longer a secret. It was real. She had become something more than what she had ever imagined. And in that moment, Ethan realized that he, too, had changed. Not just because of what they had survived, but because of what they had become together. Their bond was stronger now, forged in the heat of battle and tempered by the truth that had come to light. But even as they stood there, the dust of the conflict settling around them, they both knew that the path ahead was still uncertain. What had just happened was only the beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. Sana looked out over the desert, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. Ethan, ever by her side, followed her gaze. "What now?" he asked quietly, unsure of what the next step should be. Sana's gaze remained fixed, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We move forward. The war isn't over, Ethan. There are forces still out there, forces that we haven't even begun to understand. And there's still more to discover about the power I hold, about the truth we've uncovered." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He had seen the darkness, felt its pull, and had come face to face with the ancient power that had been at the heart of it all. He had witnessed Sana's transformation, her emergence as a being of incredible strength. But even as he processed it all, he knew that this was only a fraction of the bigger picture. The world was changing, and they were caught in the center of it. But as they prepared to leave the remnants of the battle behind, the ground beneath them began to tremble once more. This time, it wasn't the same chaotic energy they had felt before. This was different. The earth seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that wasn't just physical, it was primal. It was as though the very foundation of their world was reacting to something far more ancient and powerful. Sana's expression shifted from one of determination to one of urgency. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward her. "We need to go, now," she said, her voice filled with an unspoken fear. "There's no time to waste." Ethan didn't argue. He trusted her now more than ever. They began to move, their steps quick and purposeful, as they sought refuge in the relative safety of a nearby cave. The air around them grew thick with tension, each step feeling heavier as the energy in the ground continued to surge. As they reached the entrance of the cave, Sana paused, her face grim. "Something's happening. Something bigger than anything we've faced before. We need to figure out what's going on, and fast." Ethan turned to look at her, his mind racing. "What do we do now? How do we stop it?" Sana looked into his eyes, her expression fierce. "We don't stop it. We face it. Together." They entered the cave, the darkness swallowing them whole, but the flicker of light from their torches guided the way. Inside, the walls were etched with ancient symbols that spoke of a power beyond comprehension. They could feel it in the air, this quiet, pulsing presence that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "What is all of this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sana stepped forward, her eyes scanning the walls. "These markings. They're part of the old prophecy, the one that speaks of the balance of power, the one that tells of a time when the forces of darkness would rise again, and only those who held the key could stop it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You mean you're the key?" Sana nodded, her face set with determination. "I always have been. The power that I carry. It's not just mine. It's tied to the world, to the balance of everything. If I lose control of it, everything will collapse." Ethan's mind spun. He had known that Sana was important, but he hadn't fully understood the magnitude of her role in this. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the one who could save everything. Just then, the ground beneath them trembled again, but this time it felt different. The energy in the air was sharper, more focused. Something was coming. Something powerful, something destructive. They both turned toward the entrance of the cave, their hearts racing as the tremors intensified. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, a silhouette against the dim light. The figure stepped into the torchlight, revealing its face. It was the same figure they had seen before, the one who had once been so certain of his victory, the one who had fallen before them. But now, he was different. The darkness around him seemed to swirl and pulse, like a living entity, feeding off the energy of the earth itself. Sana stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with fury. You shouldn't have come back." The figure's lips curled into a smile, though it was a twisted, malicious one. You think you've won? You've only just begun to understand the true power of the forces you're playing with. You don't control them, Sana. You never will. Sana's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. But it was gone in an instant. I don't need to control it, she said, her voice cold. I just need to release it. Ethan stood, stunned, as the cave seemed to calm. The earth no longer trembled. The air was still, but it was different now. They had won, at least for now. Sana lowered her hands, her body trembling with exhaustion. Ethan rushed to her side, his heart racing. You did it, he said, his voice filled with awe. Sana smiled, but it was a tired, weary smile. We did it, she corrected him softly, as they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a battle that had taken everything from them. They knew the world was safe for now, but they also knew this victory was just a small piece of a much larger story. The forces that had shaped their lives were far from gone, but they were stronger now. Together, they would face whatever came next, and whatever came next, they would face it, not as two individuals, but as a team. Together, they would continue their journey, ready to uncover the mysteries of the universe and protect the fragile balance they had fought so hard to preserve. The end of one story was merely the beginning of another, and with that, they walked forward, hand in hand, into the unknown, ready to embrace whatever the future held.